Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're excited to have you join our first onboarding session, or my first onboarding session. My name is Chris Grady, Inside Systems Engineer at Veeam Software. I'm joined by Ken Fisher. If you want to introduce yourself, Ken?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Ken Fisher, Inside System Engineer here at Veeam. Been with the company for almost 2 years, so excited to have this presentation with you, and we'll all learn together.
And we're also joined by Daniel Cerrone, who will be answering questions in the QA for this one. Um, if you want to say something, Daniel, feel free.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the onboarding. I really appreciate your questions. Let you some lessons, some answers. Okay, thank you.
Sounds good. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and go off camera, and we will start the presentation. All right. So obviously, first would be the agenda. So we're going to kind of start with it's architecture and core components. I would say kind of core components and going into architecture and installing the product, kind of the nuts and bolts of that. Advanced features and optional components, general product configuration that maybe would be over or is often overlooked, but you don't want to miss. Jobs, concepts, and configurations. Restore capabilities, because it's always good to have backups say that they're successful or even test them, but to actually be able to restore in a disaster or any kind of malicious scenario is the ideal reason that you have Veeam. So restore capabilities is probably the most important, and security kind of ties into that. And then we'll kind of end it with some tips and tricks and additional resources. There's a bunch of links on that one. So that is kind of the overview for today's agenda. So this is the Veeam data platform. This is kind of the 1,000-yard view of it. Today's training is Veeam data platform, which is Foundation, Advanced, and Premium. Three separate products. We'll mostly be focused on Foundation today, but we will hint at some Advanced and Premium features, and in future webinars we'll probably do more focus on those. But to give an overview of what we offer, at the very bottom level would be like the services that you're using that you want to protect. That gives you some view of what those are. We'll get into supported systems and platforms throughout this presentation in more detail, and I'll have some QR codes that link to if you want to have it like the official documentation for your reference, but that's kind of a high-level view. We communicate with those systems to protect them through their native APIs and in all those scenarios. And then kind of that would lead to the Foundation backup and recovery that most people are familiar with, or at least by the name, you can kind of tell what it would do. Monitoring analytics, and I should have even added maybe YARA scans too. I guess that would kind of be part of that. That is the advanced portion of the Veeam data platform, and then recovery orchestration allows you to automate the testing of your backups, replicas, storage plans, and then gives really good dynamic documentation for compliance, regulatory reasons, or just if you want to have peace of mind. And so that, yeah, I think that would cover the high-level view of the data platform. So the different types of platforms that Veeam supports through Veeam data platform. And if you scan that QR code, it will take you to a page for later reference. But for today's conversation, agentless are typically like a hypervisor integration or a KVM integration. If we're talking about 12 or newer supported versions, really 12.1.2 would be recommended, but you would need to be on vSphere 6 or newer. Cloud Director 10.1 through 10.5.x. And I should mention before I skip over that, the U3 of vSphere is supported, and there's just a couple caveats that you may want to check out our KB article for if you plan on upgrading to that. It'll I'm sure like within, well, I don't want to make predictions, but that's a temporary thing because it's a new release. But U2 is fully supported with no known limitations currently. Yeah, so Windows Server 2012 through 2022, fully supported in terms of like the server OS itself as well as Hyper-V. and the VMs that would run on it would really be the context here. Azure Stack hyper-converged, that is pretty much fully supported. There are some limitations, but we have a pretty good integration with that at this point. Red Hat and Oracle KVM and Nutanix AHV would require AOS 6.5 or newer, 4.4 or newer for Red Hat. And this is true as of today. You know, it's always changing in future versions, but we always keep our documentation up to date. So if we're talking about physical machines, or if you're maybe not directly integrated hypervisor and you want to use agents to protect the VMs running on the host, these would be the different systems that the agents can support. So I should really even cloud too. I did mention that, but not in the top parentheses. But so yeah, server 2008 R2. That was one of the changes from 11 to 12. The R2 is like the cutoff now, but that's, you know, that was end of life quite a while ago. So, but we do try to be pretty backwards compatible so that we can kind of fit into. There's always legacy systems running in the environment. Speaking of IBM, but Microsoft Windows 7, Service Pack 1 through 11, cloud agents. You know, most of the major Linux distributions. That's a somewhat subjective phrasing, but I did put, there's kind of a shortened link to the supported distros as of 12.1 in our documentation if you browse to that. Mac OS 10.13.6 High Sierra through 14 Sonoma. IBM AIX 7.1.7.3 TL1 and Oracle Solaris. Various versions are supported there, and Spark is as well in the 32-bit mode though. Another way to view your data that we can protect is unstructured data, which every business has a lot of that, it seems like. Well, they're both somewhat new, but it's kind of interesting that previously we would think of S3 storage or object storage or cloud storage as like something you back up to, and most of the time in the Veeam context that is the case. You can back up from and to object storage, and of course you can back up like unstructured data using, you know, CIF shares or NFS, and if you have like a NetApp or a more enterprise type of NAS system, you can use attach like the filer under the storage integrations, and it's a bit more efficient. But worst case, if you have like unstructured data and you want to just back up a UNC path of a NAS on your network or something like that, that's ideally what that's for. The main difference between that and kind of the more traditional jobs is it's more aware of like previous versions, which can be important if it's like a file server type of share. And licensing. So it is considered the legacy model, I would say industry-wide to a certain extent, definitely with Veeam. It's still available for existing customers. I think as people's environments change, you know, it makes more sense practically being on VUL because it's more portable, flexible, and it's also Enterprise Plus, so it's a fully featured product, whereas per socket, there's different additions. And when we say per socket, what we mean is the number, like in terms of the hosts or systems that, the hosts that you're backing up, the number of CPU sockets that have a CPU installed on it that you're protecting VMs on, that would be what that's counting. So that was one way to view it, and that is still available for existing customers, but it probably would make more sense to migrate to VUL long term, especially if that aligns with your IT roadmap, which in most cases it seems like it does. Even if it's, you know, moving between physical, virtual, the file share, unstructured data I mentioned, socket is pretty much just virtual. Although you can merge the two. So it's, you know, there's options no matter what, but VUL is kind of the future, I would say. Architecture and core components. So this is kind of like a simplified view of the minimum amount of components that would be installed if you installed Veeam in like an all-in-one environment, where like it's one server that's acting as the console, the Veeam Backup Replication application, the proxy is a role that's assigned to that server by default. Same with repositories, and same with like the configuration database repository as well, but that's we'll get to that in a little bit. So the console itself is kind of the interface that you see when you interact with Veeam, at least for Veeam Backup and Replication. So that's where you would go to configure or create jobs and monitor them, add your integrations, and so on. There are, advances where you get some of the more in-depth alerting and notifications and even remediation actions, but there are like daily summaries or job level summaries that you can have upon failure, upon warning, or just every run, or just a once-a-day summary of the job history. So that would all be viewed through the console. The backup proxy is kind of the intermediary between the source data and where you're ultimately going to store the backup data in the Veeam Backup portal format. So that is usually the most resource-hungry component, at least looking at these four, because that's what's doing all the reading from production data stores, processing, compressing, deduping, sometimes handing it to a gateway server, sometimes writing it directly to backup repository. That's why I said this is kind of the minimum amount of components. In some cases, depending on what your repository is, there might be more, or in other cases, there might be other things like WAN accelerators. But for the scope of at least this slide, those are kind of the main pieces, and then you would add more as you scale out. And a backup repository is where you store your backups. And there's many different forms of those, but we cover the different types of protocols that you can attach that via in a later slide. So installation. So if it's your first time installing Veeam, or if you're upgrading it, or just need to download anything related to that, or open a support case, the Veeam customer portal is kind of your go-to. MyDevVeeam.com would take you directly to the portal, and my products would be the installer. But so yeah, with a licensed administrator account, if you sign in, then that's where you can get the installers, license keys, open support cases. There's like a talk to a manager button, which is essentially like escalating a support case. You can initiate that through there, although you have a few avenues you can do that. And there's also a lot of great, it's like kind of a compilation on like the left pane that's not fully shown from this view, but if you were to browse to it, you can see what I'm talking about. There's a lot of technical resources that are kind of consolidated there, everything from our like official help center documentation, knowledge base articles, forums, the community forums, Veeam University, a lot of other stuff too. So that's a good area to get familiar with my.veeam.com, or if you go to veeam.com and like sign in with the icon on the top right. And so once you've basically done that, you launch mount the ISO and launch the setup file, you'd be looking at this. Enterprise Manager is an optional part of the installation of Backup Replication. If you have multiple Veeam servers at several sites, and especially if you want to centrally manage the licensing between them, or if you want a little bit more advanced reporting, or if you want to centrally be able to store your encryption keys and restore them, Enterprise Manager would be needed for that. And there's other use cases too. I think in version 12 was the first version you could create a job from Enterprise Manager, so that's kind of interesting. The console, so Backup Replication kind of speaks for itself. And then the console would be like if you're trying to access the Veeam Backup Replication server from another node or another location. You're not trying to install the whole thing, but you're going to basically point it to the actual server. So it's like a client version of that. So that's the lightweight one on the bottom, but it can access the actual server if it has network access, and you can authenticate. And that's where the MFA is beneficial if there's a security concern there. So you're usually kind of nexting through this. You can, if you enable telemetry, you get a little more wiggle room with the licensing, and you can sign in to kind of have it with the license admin account to have it pull that. Worst case, if you have the file itself, you can browse to it. Before it actually starts installing, it'll go through the system configuration check. There's usually some dependencies that have to be installed. In most cases, if they're like in this one, it shows one failed, it'll just install it. And if you keep retrying it for whatever reason, it's not an obvious fix and it's not resolving that, you'd be entitled to support for that. But that's not something that's typically an issue. Yeah, I mean, so usually, I mean, yeah. So most of the time, I would probably recommend the local system as the default service account unless you have some sort of integrated third-party tool that you're intentionally doing it. But otherwise, the local system is pretty safe. The installation folders, if you have a particular reason, you can change that. The caching might be beneficial if you have certain drives that are flash or just faster, and that would be beneficial for vPower, which we'll discuss a little bit later with the vPower NFS service. Guest catalog, I mean, the database engine by default, as of now, and this is somewhat new, it will attempt to install PostgreSQL by default as opposed to SQL Express as it always has in the past. And you still can if you choose from the drop-down set of PostgreSQL. Microsoft SQL is still fully supported. There's no indication that it won't be in the future, but I think just in some cases in larger environments where either they found that PostgreSQL was more efficient in some operations, or it would just save the customer from having to purchase a SQL full license, especially in like advanced and with Veeam 1. That's where it usually seems more relevant. So that is kind of an important one, which database, because especially if you're doing like an in-place upgrade, you just want to be intentional with what you're doing there. If it's a first-time install, I would probably install PostgreSQL, unless you have a SQL full license or dedicated remote SQL server, but that we'll discuss that shortly. Configuration database doesn't store your actual backup data itself, but it stores all the information about the Veeam configuration. So it's like, when you install like a blank version of Veeam and you load it the first time, the difference between that and your fully configured environment is stored in the configuration database. So it's kind of a backup of the console itself and the settings. So if you lost that, I mean, if you look in a pinch, you could always spin up a new Veeam server, and if you have network or direct access, attach whatever repository you're trying to restore from, and then if it has network access to where you're restoring to, shouldn't be an issue, but that's not ideal. So I always put the next slide. Yeah, so basically backs itself up so that if you need to migrate or you had a disaster, and you by default it stores on the C drive under a backup folder. So you would at the very least want to change that to a different drive later than the system disk that Veeam Backup Replication is installed on. Ideally a different server altogether, or really a different location, because it's just a flat .bco file. So it shouldn't, well, yeah, I'd recommend definitely keeping that offsite, a copy of that. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. So this is kind of a little bit later. There's a more detailed view of this one, but this is kind of we gave an overview of the different components earlier. This is kind of a diagram of those with the production hypervisor also included. So, let's say you have a job, you schedule a job, and the backup server would communicate through the hypervisor using the native APIs to locate the information about the VM, the location of the VM on the SAN or on the direct storage, whatever the case may be. Initiate a snapshot in most cases, not always though, and then it would start flowing kind of as the diagram suggests through the proxies, which I described their purpose earlier, to the repositories, and then you have your backup file. And kind of the main benefit there, well, aside from not a single point of failure, is that Veeam backup files are very portable. You can, if you have the full backup, or if it's incremental, like the whole chain, and the metadata file, you can literally copy and paste those to another folder or repository, or anything that would allow you to paste it to it or copy to it, and if you import that into Veeam, you'll be able to read it because it's the Veeam format. So that's pretty beneficial, especially if there's as issues are more complicated. That's a nice thing to have. All right, so backup proxy I've used as kind of a generic term to communicate as like kind of the middleman between the hypervisor, or the, like, most cases hypervisor or NAS filer, and the repository. So obviously there would be different types of those. The VMware one, so by default you would have a VMware backup proxy, and it's referred to here as a general purpose. In the interface they call it an agent proxy. It's kind of just a general purpose proxy for, as it shows, like a NAS, file shares, in some cases physical servers, but not by default. So yeah, so VMware VMs would have, that's kind of a straightforward process. The CDP, you can assign to existing managed servers that are already added to Veeam inventory, but they do need to be specifically added as CDP proxies due to their integration with the IO filter. Hyper-V on host and off host, and there's slides where we go through these. Nutanix, so basically any hypervisor that we would have, Red Hat, Oracle, KVM, Nutanix, AHV, there would be either an appliance or a proxy. We somewhat use them interchangeably depending on the type of system, but kind of the same idea, and that's kind of what we put that in parentheses. So responsibilities that I kind of alluded to earlier, but there is one other thing. It also does, like, in 12.1 there was some kind of interesting new features with scanning that occurs during the backup process itself, or just after, comparing it to like a metadata index. So it'd be like the inline entry scan in that case. And I put an asterisk because that does require Enterprise Plus or VUL. If you have VUL, you have Enterprise Plus. Yeah, I think we already covered that one. So these are okay. So transport modes. So by default with Veeam, and in most cases this works well, but at scale it's the least efficient mode of transporting the proxy like the data from production through the proxy to the repository. But the benefit to it is it's not picky at all about what it's reading from or writing to, so it will work in most scenarios if it has network access, hence the name. And that stands for Network Block Device Protocol. So the process for that, the proxy would send an API request to the host, locate the VM, and that proxy was basically instructed to do that from the scheduling of the VBR server. The host locates the VM. VBR instructs vSphere in this case to create a snapshot. The proxy will copy the VM data blocks from the source storage and send them to the proxy, through the proxy to the repository over the LAN. Okay. So a slightly better mode in most cases. I mean, it's not like good, better, best, but generally speaking, network mode, like in order of most efficient, it would be network mode, virtual appliance mode, or hot-add, sometimes it's referred to, and then direct SAN. So virtual appliance, it would be an actual VM running on the host in question, where the VM that you're wanting to protect is stored. So the backup server sends a request to this kind of similar process, except the VM that, since it's, the VM that you're backing up, the proxy has iSCSI read-only writes to, so it kind of a little bit less latency, it's often a bit faster. The snapshot process. So yeah, that's the kind of the key difference. The disk are attached, hot added, hence the name, to the proxy. So it's a little bit less latency between the host and the proxy for that initial read. Yep. And then of course, and this is important, once it's done, because it is, it's using API calls to trigger snapshots on the hypervisor. Once it's done, the disks are detached from the proxy in this case, but in any case, the VM snapshot is deleted, or it should at least. Direct storage access. Veeam uses the vSphere storage APIs or the VMware v80p for direct VM data transport over SAN. A few different protocols you could use to use that. Most commonly would be Fiber Channel or iSCSI. Most of this part is usually the same, except in this case, it's communicating directly with the blocks are being translated or sent directly from the SAN to the proxy. So that's probably the most efficient way to do it, unless there's a direct storage integration, which we will get to a little bit later on. But in most cases, if you have, especially if you have like a 10 gig LAN, but or what your change rate and expectations for backup window are, network works okay. But as you optimize, these are kind of the directions you'd go in, unless you know that you're if you have like a storage system from that diagram that we have integrations with, you definitely would want to use that before these. But these can improve if that's not an option, if there's not a direct integration with the SAN. So yeah, so that was kind of discussing the vSphere proxy. Hyper-V proxy in some ways is more straightforward and also more complicated depending on if you're going to use on-host or off-host, really. In most cases, people use on-host, and instead of VMware snapshots, it uses the VSS service that most people are familiar with to facilitate the equivalent of a snapshot that Veeam can use as a source. So by default, if you were to add a Hyper-V cluster or Hyper-V standalone server to your Veeam inventory to protect the data on it, you would use on-host mode, and most people do. It basically just uses spare resources on the cluster or individual node hosting the machines, and it's still using the same VSS service. That typically works in my experience, at least. The times where that is not a recommended configuration would be like if you don't have many spare resources on that particular Hyper-V node, then you'd probably want a separate standalone, but that will be on the next slide. But yeah, so it's instructing Hyper-V VSS to create a point-in-time VM copy and snapshot, or checkpoint is kind of the terminology I use. And then, yeah, the Veeam transport service reads that and sends it to the repository. So it's kind of a similar process, at least between Hyper-V and VMware, but the different terminology. And then there's always a cleanup operation at the end because we don't want snapshots collecting. Although there is a snapshot cleanup tool if that is an issue, but that shouldn't be in most cases. So off-host proxy is a little bit pickier. In the sense that it requires the versions of the Hyper-V host to match, and it has to be basically a non-clustered node separate from the environment that you're protecting, that you're allocating that role to. But other than that, the process is the same. It's just, using resources on the same platform that you're protecting them. Do you have enough resources to facilitate that, or do you need to have a separate one off host? If you on host would be recommended unless there's an issue with that aforementioned performance thing. So backup proxy / appliance, and that's where we start to use it somewhat interchangeably with like the KVMs. And with all the seeming like at least a talk of change going on where people are kind of considering all their options. There's some interesting ones here. Proxmox is not officially supported, but it's been announced to be down the road. And these are kind of the three big ones that are currently supported in terms of KVMs. So we'll start with Nutanix AHV. So the appliance itself, so it uses AHV's native capabilities, as we always do, native APIs, to create image level backups. And it does use protection domains if you need to be, if the protection domain offers app consistency, Veeam will honor that. And so yes, it is agentless. initiates it, uses the Nutanix REST API to link with the cluster, generating a snapshot for the VMs of the protection domain, creates a volume group. This is kind of a recurring trend, just different terminology, but it is important depending on your particular hypervisor. One thing here is that a little bit different with this particular one is that the appliance or the proxy is also the like in some cases like where you'd actually edit some of the settings, although increasingly less so it seems. Like you can edit the job from the traditional Veeam VBR console, but that is not the case with the other HVs, and historically it was not with Nutanix, but the integrations are getting better, I suppose. Yeah, so then it stores the data. And so we kind of use them interchangeably. They are somewhat similar. They both use the same, at least as far as Veeam is concerned, in terms of a method to trigger a app consistent snapshot of a backup. We can kind of use the same terminology. So if you wanted to protect workloads running on those types of systems, and you add that appliance, well, first you'd install the plugin, and the same case would be for any of these AHV plugins. And you add the appliance or deploy the appliance. And so once you kick off the job, initiates the job, sends the data to the appliance, which is kind of a few things, but also a proxy, probably most important in terms of resource usage. Interfaces with the virtualization manager via REST APIs, so that's a native RHV or Oracle thing, to generate the snapshot, establishes the image transfer session, and sends the data. How to add a backup proxy. So this example is how to add a VMware proxy. So it's you would go to backup infrastructure, either add proxy on the top left or yeah, just add proxy on the top left. VMware backup proxy is pretty straightforward. We try to make it easy. Okay, so yeah, so this would be once you've clicked that, and then if you've already added managed servers under the backup infrastructure setting, you'll see those different servers from the dropdown. If you need to add a new one, it's just a matter of the ports being open and a network path being available, and the host name or IP address, and being able to log into it with at least a local admin account. Transport mode we discussed earlier. Actually, so if you do automatically select, it will attempt to, as I kind of hinted, the good, better, best with like network by default, but it will try hot add and then direct storage access. Automatically select, in theory, will attempt to use the highest one that is possible for it to. So if none of these stuff's configured, it'll just default to network. If sometimes I have seen in the past where just setting it to what you want it to use will actually get it to work, but that's usually like a bug, or that's rare. It will automatically select the most efficient method by default in most cases. So, and then I think it's good to check the box to fail over network mode if the primary mode fails. If there's just some kind of issue with the iSCSI initiator, and you're using the virtual appliance, and like you still want the job to complete in some form. It might take a little longer or more impact on the VM, but that's a good box to check. And then if you're concerned about encrypting the traffic between the host to the proxy, you can check that box there, but that does have a performance cost. Typically, I mean, you can manually select certain data stores if you want. This doesn't mean that you're like licensing these by adding all the data stores, though. That would be consumed through the job. So most people automatically detect the data stores, unless it's a huge environment and you're trying to save time or something. Max concurrent task is somewhat of an important one. RAM is RAM is definitely relevant for proxies, but it's kind of more of a generic, 8 or 16 gigabytes of RAM, but not even really that. There is a formula for that as well, but cores tends to be the bottleneck when you see proxy as bottleneck from the Veeam job session log, in my opinion. So a task from the proxy's perspective would be like one VM disk. So you could be using more than one concurrent tasks for one VM, but most of the time you probably would. And in most cases, you can kind of, it goes by the amount of like vCPUs, and you can usually like essentially double it. So if you have like 4 core on there, you could set it to 8 or 8 to 16. It has kind of a nice little easy button to where you can, if it's a dedicated proxy, I wouldn't do this on like if it's the Veeam console, because we do recommend leaving a few cores for other roles. But if it's a dedicated proxy and you just want to allocate all the resources to that role, which kind of makes sense, you can literally keep clicking the up arrow until that green check mark turns into an exclamation point, and then just click down one. That's kind of a funny way to think about it, but that at least that will ensure you're getting the most out of it. I wouldn't think of it like that if you are if you have a device doing more than one thing at once. And we do have calculators, but it's just that check mark is there, so that's what that represents. So these are the many different types, because in my opinion, one of the benefits of Veeam is its flexibility. Like it will fit into almost any existing environment you have. As you can see, so right now we're talking about backup repositories. So yeah, so it can be local, remote. It's where you'd be restoring your backups or storing them. We do recommend the 32110. So you'd want to have multiple copies on different medias offsite with different types of integrations to make sure that you achieve true data resiliency. So we try to offer as many options as possible to make that realistic. Yeah, I mean, so direct attached storage would be just like a server with either literal direct attached or what appears to be direct attached, like if it's an iSCSI attached drive or something. Network attached storage, you can add like an SMB or NFS share. Most dedupe devices will require a gateway server in between, but it's kind of just like a pass-through device that the Veeam Data Mover service gets installed on. Exagrid is one exception from that, just because it's awesome. They're all awesome, but it just doesn't require the Exagrid. I mean, the gateway server. But dedupe devices are, especially in terms of backups and in investments, they're pretty useful for long-term, especially like archival purposes. Object storage, of course, too, is a great way to store in the cloud or make it part of your plan to restore to the cloud, or many different reasons. But anything that is S3 compatible would probably be the simplest way to say it. You can back up to, and object storage, cloud storage kind of gets used interchangeably. Most of the and then immutability will be supported for like Amazon, Azure. Most of them. Google Cloud is one exception. IBM Cloud is one as well, from those lists. So these are like the Veeam proprietary file types. I mean, if you want to know all these, it definitely couldn't hurt. You probably don't need to know all of them, but there are a few that you would probably want to know. Those top 3 are going to be definitely relevant, at least for like traditional backups and incrementals in the metadata file. You definitely need that metadata file, even if you think you have a full backup. The VRB, it might be good to know that will be deprecated, I believe, in version 13 or released soon. So that's not a recommended configuration, but if you do see that, that's what that is. BCO, I hinted at earlier, that is the file format of the Veeam configuration backup. So it's just like a backup of the Postgres or SQL database that Veeam settings are stored in. This tape full backup file, that's usually abstracted through the interface, but good to know. Log backup files are probably good to know. And the vblob, vindex, vslice are kind of specific to what we call the NAS backup or file share backup. And there are enterprise plugins, of course, as well. Yeah, so that's a Windows backup repository. I think that's pretty straightforward, but we've already kind of shown this diagram. But that would be that. A lot of people do. So that's probably what it would look like if you had an all-in-one scenario, because currently Veeam Backup Replication can only, the console, like the server itself can only be, or really the console too, can only be ran on Windows, although coming soon on Linux too. And we can have proxies and repositories, of course, run on Linux, but just the actual application Anyway, so yeah, so the SMB, like if you're doing backing up to a SMB repository, if you don't have like a NAS file or something, and I kind of said this about another component earlier, like the gateway server is kind of you need something in between an unstructured object that can have a Veeam data mover service on it so you can communicate with it. That's all that is. You just want to make sure that's not the bottleneck. Yeah, so kind of similar there. Depends if you're doing direct to object storage or if you're going to attach the object storage repository to a scale out. But you do have the option of having to go, if you're doing direct object storage, most of the time it would just be direct, but gateways might make sense in some cases. And S3 is not necessarily cloud. I mean, that's not news to everyone, but Object First is, and many others are pretty cool on-prem S3 that I feel like I've increasingly seen customers use, so that's cool. How to add a repository. So kind of similar to adding a proxy, but the next section down. So at the top left, so if you have backup repositories highlighted and you select add repository at the top left, then these are your options. So I kind of have discussed these. Yeah, we have gone through that. So once you choose what system or what you're adding, you would either choose the managed server that is hosting that or add new for that. This is direct attached in this example, so that's why it's that specific, but wouldn't necessarily look like this, but in this example, it will be direct attached storage, but it can be Linux server, Windows server. Yeah. And you choose where you want to store it. Concurrent task, it is similar to like we use that terminology similar to how we talk about it with the proxies. So that can be a potential place to look if you're wanting to make sure that you're not like bottlenecking yourself, so to speak. It defaults to 4 usually, I believe. But either way, that setting can definitely be changed, and you can't. Well, yeah, but you'd want that to line up with the amount of vCPUs that at any given time would be writing to that repository. And if you want to set like a throttle limit, you can as well. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty good about saying the things that defaulting the recommended settings and also hinting that they are recommended. Aligning the backup file. So these are set like those two checked, like would be checked by default. But it does the top one by aligning the backup file data blocks. It just improves performance at the cost of the backup size by a somewhat negligible amount. Decompress backup file data blocks before storing. That's usually relevant for non-execute dedupe devices, I would say. That's probably generally true. And then if you're doing like most of the time with backed by rotated drives, that I see that as like if you're trying to do a makeshift air-gapped form of backups, which I mean that is a good way to do it if that's the only way to do it. So what that box is basically doing is like if you plug in a different, if it's the same repository but it's a different, like if it basically in effect if it's a different drive that you plugged in and it doesn't see the previous chain files that it's expecting, it'll just run an active full. So that way you'll have a continuous flow of jobs completing despite changing out whatever form of rotated drives that you're rotating. Per machine file backup at this point, especially if you want to use the Veeam mover feature, which is not something you use every day, but will definitely be beneficial occasionally if you make like a hardware change and need to, especially if you use like a dedupe device, you need to move data between repositories or move data between repositories basically. But that just creates a separate file for each machine in the job as opposed to one job, or I mean, as opposed to one file for all the VMs in the job. So this is like if you're restoring. So and anything whenever you see those server drop downs, it's like you can always add a new one, or the drop down list would be like what's under managed servers under backup infrastructure. So you choose you want it to be one with probably a lot of resources, because you don't want, typically when you're recovering, you want that to be fast, right? Cache in the sense that if you have a drive letter that is flash or faster, and the nature of the recovery, having that write cache might make a difference, then specifying that drive would be worth doing. And then vPower NFS, that's checked by default. And you can customize the ports though. All right, so scale out backup repositories. That's it. Well, I don't think I meant to do it in that order, but we're gonna skip that. So yeah, so scale out repository is a way to combine multiple tiers of storage, or even extents in the same tier of storage. If you have a bunch of on-prem repositories that you want to combine, and then it allows you to tier off into separate ones. But the convenient part about it, or why it's referred to as one entity, is despite it being up to 3 different tiers of different types of storage, and you can facilitate retention and how the data flows between them. The job itself is targeting like one repository. Like you would name the scale out something, and that's what you'd be targeting. So it kind of creates one logical unit, although they are not. They follow different retention depending on how you configure it. And object storage is not necessarily like capacity tier. Typically would be cloud, but it doesn't. Any S3 compatible on-prem, you could offload to capacity tier. So performance tier is where it will initially land after the is read and transferred through the proxy. So this would be like your traditional repository before it is offloaded to the cloud. Not always, but that's usually kind of why you'd be creating scale outs. Sometimes people create scale outs if they have a lot of local extents and they want to kind of use it as one repository for space reasons or many reasons. Most people use it for cloud though. But so you would choose a repository. One thing that you just choose a repository and then go from there. I would probably leave those as default. Personally, I recommend data locality. I don't know how much I personally recommend data locality, but it basically prioritizes keeping backup files and incrementals on the same extent within the performance tier, whereas performance will try to separate them, which can potentially, at least in theory, increase performance. But the idea of separating incrementals from their dependency files is, I don't know. I don't see many people do it. And it's usually not a performance issue. But you can do it if you want to. And that's kind of an extra check to avoid that if that is a concern. So to get to the scale out, and so here's where you're kind of adding your S3 compatible or object storage. So that would already have been added, or you can add it through the wizard as well, but the container bucket would be created. You would choose it from there once it's been added. And then, so there's different modes. So copy mode basically means, I think by default, there's a registry key to customize if you want to check more frequently or less frequently, but every 4 hours it will check to see if there's by default, we'll check to see if there's new backup files on the performance tier. And if there is, it will offload them to the capacity tier if just copy is checked. If just move is checked, and let's say it's basically going to say move backups older than X amount of days, and it does need some sort of full backup ran for that to actually be triggered. So sometimes it will be up to 7 more or less than what you said there. But that's typically if you wanted different retention for your performance tier and capacity tier. And you can check both boxes as well. And that's for if you wanted to have it still checking for backups every 4 hours, uploading is off, like often or more quickly, because the move might be once a week upload. With copy check, it's basically saying move basically means delete to the local repository. So you want less retention locally if you have move and copy checked, typically. And then, by default, data in flight would be encrypted, but if you want it encrypted, double encrypted, I guess, you can set that there. Or if you want to just the object storage level encryption, you can set that there. You can set a window to when it can run if you want. That's just highly situational. Health checks, that's basically like a logical CRC scan to see if there's any logical corruption of the file from that view. So it's not as thorough as like a SureBackup test, but if it's a capacity like that, if it's not a cost concern or performance concern, it's a good thing to do just to stay ahead of any potential corruption issues. But there are more thorough testing capabilities within Veeam Data Platform as well. Speaking of that, so SureBackup, SureReplica, and then kind of the underlying kind of core of those features, Virtual Lab, sometimes referred to as Data Lab. So SureBackup allows you to automate the testing of your backups and to perform recoverability testing in 12.1 content scans or like malware scans or YARS scans. Depending on your licensing, but it typically or traditionally at least would be used to verify, because it's one thing to see your backups are completing and you see the files being generated. The chances of corruption with Veeam is very low anyway, but sometimes the peace of mind speaks for itself. I would say sometimes you have to see it for yourself to believe it, and that's kind of what SureBackup does. Or sometimes you have like compliance or regulatory requirements to where you have to prove that you can restore even maybe within a certain RPO and RTO, and that's the part of the Veeam Data Platform where the premium would come into play. But that's slightly outside the scope of today's video. But in terms of but it's kind of similar in terms of what the virtual lab. So it's basically you would create the virtual lab, but that's probably the most of the setup, depending on how many hosts and network VLANs you have on the production side that you'd be wanting to test that you're protecting with Veeam. But between professional services and our support team, we can assist with that. So depending on if you do like SureBackup Lite or the full SureBackup test, it will start the VM using the vPower NFS service, which basically mounts that backup file as an NFS share to the virtual lab inside like an isolated network environment. So that way you're actually booting the VM directly from the repository in read-only mode in an isolated network environment from the rest of the environment, so you don't have to worry about like duplicate IPs or host names. Perform a set of tests you can do the CRC scan. The heartbeat would be like a hypervisor level check. Ping test would make sure the network settings worked correctly and that it can connect to the network. You can attach scripts with SureBackup if you want to do further testing custom-wise. And then depending on your version, there are also with like SureBackup Lite, you can integrate with third-party antivirus or use our malware, like native malware detection tools. And then in the case of SureReplica, you can even do like the YARS scans if you have advanced. So you can get a little ahead of myself there, but we basically and so at the end it kind of tells you the results of that. And since this is a Veeam Data Platform webinar, the report, if you like that and you want what I would call that like on steroids, just put it simply, like a lot more out of the box checks and way better documentation, that's where the premium part of Veeam Data Platform would really shine. So yes, I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but so it publishes it in the isolated environment and does kind of what you tell it to. So full recoverability testing would be the traditional SureBackup. So it's using the vPower NFS service to actually make sure it can boot and integrate with the hypervisor, and you can get documentation showing that, or at least like a notification in it with SureBackup. If you want to do the backup verification and content scan, that's less resource usage. So if that is specifically what you're trying to do, that would save you time to do it that way and it would have less impact. So it depends what you're trying to do, but you can create jobs for both. So that I kind of already discussed this, but the proxy appliance is kind of as like, there has to be a way for the Veeam server to still communicate with something on your production network, but then within that it has to have an isolated network. So that's what the virtual lab is. It's like a lightweight Linux VM with somewhat of a routing engine built into it that you deploy to one of your hosts, and that's what that proxy appliance represents. Well, somewhat, but so yeah, so it uses the NFS service to mount the backup file in read-only mode, which is nice. So that way, if you're using it for like beyond just making sure it can boot, if you want to like test out some CrowdStrike updates or something, and see what happens, you can do it in a read-only mode. That was a joke, by the way, but like, you can use it for testing purposes, like where you can keep the virtual lab running after the SureBackup job. People will do that, and since it's read-only mode, you can kind of do it without fear of breaking anything. And then if it does break something, then you know, and then you can shut it down. And since it's read-only mode, it'll revert back, or was never really changed to begin with. So that's kind of fun. And yeah, we discussed that. So SureReplica is similar, but in the context of testing a replica. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if it needs to be explained much more than that, at least on this tab. But it does the same things. It's just the different context is one is you're testing a backup, one you're testing a Veeam replica. And yeah, this is kind of like the on-demand sandbox, like I was hinting at earlier, like kind of a secondary use case or maybe primary use case, who knows? But to me, it's a nice added feature with the SureBackup is that you can leave it running after SureBackup job. So you can console into that, and if you're wanting to like do something in like a risk-free environment, basically you can do it there, testing, security, training, troubleshooting. They're written to redo logs for VM backups. It's basically stores on like a different like data store, and the Delta files are deleted after you're done. So it's that's pretty cool, especially if you're testing something. So I'm gonna stay on the slide a moment because I like that article because it kind of gives you, it's like a nice one-page article of the different forms of immutability in a fair amount of detail, but we'll discuss it as well. So yeah, the definition of, I suppose that people define it differently, but how we define it is typically like a software-defined feature that would refers to it. It basically means like read-only mode, so it can't be modified or deleted, but you can read from it, and you can encrypt to kind of cover that side of it. So the benefits of an immutability obviously would be the data integrity and security, because if you can't delete or encrypt or modify a file, then it's as long as you can still restore it, you're in pretty good shape. Provides protection against ransomware and accidental deletions. Supported types of immutable repositories, there are a lot. I guess this would cover it, but somewhere in the slide there is like a QR code that links to a page that you can look at all the different vendors, but we can always help if there's questions in the Q&A on if something is supported for immutable. But Amazon S3 storage, not any S3 compatible, a lot of the S3 compatible, and one of the QR codes will clarify that later on. But Azure Object Storage, Wasabi, Backblaze, there's a lot of them that have immutability supported. Of course, any supported Linux distro that you run as a repository, we have integration with the Linux kernel for immutability there. So that's what the hardened repository refers to. These are somewhat new, and I think version 12-ish. HP eStore once and Dell Data Domain, and potentially more going forward. I believe they call it like retention lock or similar name, but it's the same feature basically, and it's a direct integration through Veeam now for that. Whereas before it could work in parallel, but it was like two separate screens, so it's more directly integrated, and that list will be growing. So those are the different forms that you can have, and immutability is probably, previously it was, well, disasters obviously still do happen, but it seems like increasingly it's more of a concern about like ransomware or malware, or even malicious employees or something. So this is probably one of the, at least with the foundation product, maybe even overall, this is probably the single biggest thing you can do to have peace of mind that if you're following 32110, and this is one of those numbers, the immutability. So if the Linux hardened repository, this is kind of what that would look like if this screenshot is like assuming you clicked like add backup repository and chose like Linux direct storage. So this is a kind of a nifty thing. We do this on purpose so that we don't store a root account in the database, because root account by nature in Linux can remove the immutability property flag. So if somehow the Veeam database was compromised, we didn't want a scenario where the root account could be taken, because then the whole thing could be compromised. So you basically can create a temporary elevated account. That's what that single use credential is. You can delete it after, you can make it a regular user after, one of the two probably. And so that way you have that for the initial to root access or sudoers level access to connect to the Linux server with that level, and then install the required data remover service. Yeah, because the single use doesn't store the credentials, and it's aware of that. If I think it used to be an option, now it's required, which is good, because the whole point of this feature is security. Yeah, so if you did everything right, you will be able to check that and click next without seeing an error. If the Linux server, we recommend using XFS as the file system that you're going to be using as the drive that you're storing backups on. If you check the box for fast clone, you'll be able to utilize that. And then mutability, you would set the amount of time there. It's always a question of balancing what's realistic with being safe, but the higher the number, in theory, the longer you'll be able to go back if it's some kind of sleeping malware that nobody seems to be able to catch. Yeah, so this is kind of the same thing, but with an S3 bucket. So it's using different APIs communicating with different systems. So in this case, Sam's on S3. So they all would kind of look like this, though. You would just define the data center of the region, the bucket, and then the folder, and you can create the folder if it's not created already. If you want to limit the storage, you can set that. I don't believe that's set by default. Mutable, you definitely would probably, if it's compatible with the S3 vendor, I would definitely recommend that. And then depending on like your cost preferences, you can use the infrequent access storage. But that's only cost effective if you store backups for a certain amount of time. But I think it like warns you, or it's definitely documented worst case, and we're happy to answer questions about that. All right, storage integration. So I think I hinted at that earlier. With the transport modes, different ways to make it more efficient for backup and restore. This would be if the SAN that the hypervisor you're backing up from is compatible with, if you go to that would take you to the page that kind of is like the directory for that in a sense, if you set the right filters. But like, so the storage integration, SAN integration through VMware backs up basically. Still to initially send the API to VMware, like locate where it is on the SAN, but it allows for often a more efficient backup, at the very least with backup from storage snapshot, less impact on the VM that's being backed up or replicated during that window. In some integrations, you can orchestrate snapshots from across storage arrays, or restore from storage snapshot as well if it's a integrated storage device. If it's integrated NAS, like the NetApp would be like an example of that. That's like where the NAS filer comes into play. It's not required, but it would be more efficient. And then Veeam agent integration if it's something that's Windows that's stored on compatible storage. So this is kind of the flow of the data, kind of similar to the other ones. The idea is you want less latency or less API calls. So the more aware of it is, the more aware of the storage device where ultimately it's reading from, the faster it will run, the less it will impact the VM. And most importantly, I think it's a later slide, but like in this context, the snapshot is only open for a brief moment with the backup from storage snapshot integration. Whereas with the traditional backup, the snapshots open the entire backup process. So if that's a long backup, you might see some impact on the production side. So like it's not unheard of in those cases for like a really high change rate server to noticeably slower when it's being backed up like that. And that's where the storage integrations can make a huge difference, or even just transport mode change. But if it's an integration, you would definitely want to take advantage of that, especially if you have Enterprise Plus. And this is what I just basically said. But it's good to see the visual. So like, yeah, so that basically the more that you have that snapshot open, the more it will have to consolidate on the hypervisor side, which will impact the VM. So you notice that it's a lot less time, whereas the backup continues on. So that's more efficient. If you have like a fiber channel SAN, and if you have a physical server with like a fiber channel card attached to it, then it's likely a lot faster, although that may not necessarily be true, but oftentimes if fiber channel is possible, that's ideal. Yeah, so it's kind of like well, it's somewhat set up by itself. You have to add the device to Veeam under storage infrastructure. And from that link I showed earlier, you can see the full list of SAN integrated, but we're happy to answer any questions on that either now or in the Q&A. Yeah, that's what that would look like. So I guess we're choosing NetApp in this example. And so that would be like more of a filer type of integration, but that is a storage integration. So, but this process would look pretty much the same since it's a filer. That's why you don't see the block storage for Windows servers checked. I mean, you may not necessarily do that anyway, but typically you would. So you'd have to, host name or IP, choose, if it's VMware, like whatever's relevant in terms of the role. Authenticate it. You can, if there is usually that would be the port, but if you can change it if you have something custom. Protocol to use, it's just the protocol it's already sharing out from that you need to connect to. So you just choose that, and then if you want to exclude certain volumes, you can. It will grab all by default. Proxies, you can specify a group of them, one of them, or automatically select. And automatically select, I would generally recommend unless you run into issues and need to statically set a group or individual proxies, but it usually is able to determine that, assuming you're not like it's just not like undersized or something. Mount server is a restore thing, but that is relevant when you're restoring it. So you'd want that to be a server with the idea at the high levels. You don't want that to be a bottleneck, the mount server. Yeah. So this is checked by default, that backup from storage snapshot, but you have to add the storage device for it to actually use it. You can limit the VM count per snapshot if you want to. And I personally recommend failover to standard backup. If for whatever reason that integration doesn't work one night randomly, you'd still have some form of backup. Some people have a different approach. They actually want to know if that they wanted to see the failure so that that integration issue is brought to their attention. Just depends what the higher priority is. You'll be notified either way, most likely. Yeah, so this is kind of this is like if you have certain types of storage integrations where the idea is if you have like an array of like kind of clustered storage volumes, you can back up from the secondary array so that it doesn't put a load on your primary array that your production systems are running on during backup. So that slightly different way that it does it, but it's alleviating the load on the production system, which ultimately is what gets users complaining when it's slow. So that's ideal. And then this, I think, this is, I think the last slide for me. This is not really, a lot of this is nothing to do with storage snapshot integration, but it's just more information on the flow and some of the additional features.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a good break. Gonna pick up where Chris left off. Thanks, Chris, for doing the first section there. I'm gonna be doing the rest of it here today for us. So the first chapter we're gonna be talking about briefly here is regarding tape. Obviously, tape is still relevant today. It's somewhat of a popular choice still for storing your backups, for long-term archiving, or just storing things off-site. Following a 3-2-1 framework and meeting those company guidelines. So let's get going here. Just overall, Veeam does support LTO 3 through LTO 9 and IBM type tape libraries there. Obviously, like I said, the purpose of this is long-term archiving, or just meeting those company guidelines, compliance requirements, or whatnot, following those 3-2-1 rules. Obviously, we have the immutable backups. If you're not able to do an immutable backup, having an air-gapped backup through a tape is, something we like to see people doing as well. So the type of data that we can use for archiving is, obviously, you can do your VM backups. You can do agent backups to tape. You can back up your entire backup repository, including those hardened Linux repositories, to a tape infrastructure as well. Obviously, any file to tape backups as well, unstructured data, things like that, file shares, you are able to process those as well. Tape connections, both direct fiber channel and serial attached SCSI are supported. And I think I'll talk about that here in the next slide to see kind of the infrastructure overview here. So obviously, to work with the tape library, you'll just need to deploy a software role on a server just called the tape server. This component is responsible for transferring data to the tape device. It could be either a Windows or a Linux machine connected to that tape server. It kind of performs like a proxy. It's doing that read-write operations. It's doing the data flow. It's loading the tapes into the library. These tape servers, it could be like a dedicated server, a physical server. In case of an all-in-one installation, it could even be the same server as the VBR server. Just kind of depends on the flow there. One thing to keep in mind, after you install the role, you just need to make sure you've installed the required drivers for that tape library. Then you would be able to, once everything's happy, you've got the tape library added, you would be able to just start going into the Veeam UI then and doing, backup to tape or creating those file to tape feature sets there. That's about all I have on the tape right now. I know this one was kind of just short and brief, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the Q&A. I know we have, some more in-depth articles and things like that regarding the tape aspects. Next, we're going to talk about the WAN accelerators, though. This is pretty much just a component that can be useful for backup copies jobs or replication jobs. It's pretty much the only two forms that they can be used in. Maybe you're familiar with them, maybe you're not, but a WAN accelerator only functions for Veeam. So when you go into Veeam and actually add the WAN accelerator, it's not going to be like a dual purpose for something else. It is strictly only for Veeam. Can't be used for anything else on that end. Basically, in short, the accelerator can be described as a cache for previously transferred blocks that can be used to lower the load on the network. So I guess as an example there, if a previous identified block is sent again from, let's just say, the day before, Veeam will see it and it will only transmit the hash across the network and not the data itself. If the data didn't change, it's not going to just keep doing it over and over. The data at the target location from the WAN accelerator would be extracted from the cache, and so that's giving you that reduced network traffic flow. As you can see here, in order to use the WAN accelerators, you would need 2 of them. You would need one at the source location as well as one at the target location. And they basically function in, when you go to set them up, in 2 different modes. So we have the high bandwidth mode. So that's for links over 100 megabytes per second, as well as low bandwidth mode. And that's going to be for links slower than 100 megabytes per second. One thing to keep in mind, that the low bandwidth mode doesn't use a global cache, but it uses kind of like a faster compression method. It's got optimized dedupe mechanisms and things like that. So let's just say if we want to see how to deploy a WAN accelerator here. So first things first, we're going to have to go to the backup infrastructure in the lower left-hand corner and go into your WAN accelerators. From there, at the top left, you could click Add WAN Accelerator. And you will be having to choose which server to go that you want the WAN accelerator to be. So you could either choose an existing server, or you could add your own a new server for having that WAN accelerator role. So once we're on the screen, you can see here it's using a traffic port there that by default it's 6165. Obviously, you could change these if you needed to. You can also see that we are able to, use multiple upload streams. I believe 5 is the default in this case. And then obviously there's a check to do that high bandwidth if you're having 100 plus megabytes per second there. So the next thing here is obviously the cache. When you're going through, you will specify a cache folder and size. We have some good documentation that dives into the cache sizing. So if you're curious about this, I would say please ask the question. We can provide the documentation for the cache sizing. It's kind of a bit much to cover in the section today, but once you apply that appropriate cache sizing, then you would be able to hit next, review those settings, and hit apply. Right there. So now if you need to start using the WAN accelerators that you just created, like I said, you would have to go into either a replica job, or in this case today, we're just going to be showing the backup copy job. Under the data transfer section here, you'll see the option for the WAN accelerators. So you choose the source WAN accelerator as well as the target WAN accelerator. And when you run the job, it basically just starts utilizing it from there. And you can see, obviously, this is the same thing for a replication job. It's under the data transfer. You would be able to specify those WAN accelerators there as well. So that's what that window would look like. We're going to move right into the Enterprise Manager. So Enterprise Manager, it's kind of like a control job operations. I usually describe it as like a single pane of glass for monitoring multiple Veeam servers. It has kind of many cases here, but people will use it for monitoring all those different servers if you have more than one, as well as like a license management server. So if you have multiple Veeam servers, instead of breaking up those licenses, kind of like what we talked about before, you would be able to just go in and install that bulk license in Enterprise Manager, and it will filter and use those licenses on those Veeam servers automatically as those jobs kick off. The other thing, it kind of also provides you the option to do like a self-service portal. And it also piggybacks off of some job settings to do like one-click restores. And obviously I will get into that here a little bit. So to install Enterprise Manager, you would use the same ISO that VBR is included on. When you launch that, in this case 12.1 ISO, you will see the option to install Veeam Backup Enterprise Manager. Super easy, straight to the point. You could just click on that and get the install going. During the installation, we're going to go through a system configuration check. We're going to make sure everything's happy. It's going to try to install things that may be missing. You can do a retry. If it fails and maybe it'll hit it on the next pass, you might have to do something manually or work with our support team to get something up and running. Now, keep in mind, usually if some components weren't there and it does install them, you may need to do a reboot. So just keep that in mind. Same thing here is you can sign in with your Veeam account, or you can just browse for your license file and apply your licensing directly into the Enterprise Manager installation window here. The pretty much the last step here for installing Enterprise Manager is going to be choosing what type of database you want Enterprise Manager to use. By default, it should be installing a PostgreSQL Server database. However, you can do the customized settings options, and you can do a drop down and specify MS SQL, or specify a different server. It doesn't have to be necessarily on a local database, but just keep that in mind. You do have the functionality to put that where you choose. So this is going to be kind of like architecture standpoint. So kind of in the middle there, we have the Enterprise Manager server. And then below those, we have those Veeam Backup and Replication servers. So we can start adding those to communicate to the Enterprise Manager database. Basically, our database for the VBR servers, they're going to be talking to the Enterprise Manager database and doing that data collection. So when you do open up that web console for Enterprise Manager, you will see all of your jobs listed there. Same thing for VMware vCenter. You can do some data collection through there. And I will get into that here in a moment. I believe I have a slide on that. But we just want to make sure everything stays up to date. So if you're monitoring that as your single pane of glass under one location, you will see everything up to date as much as possible. Obviously, Enterprise Manager, it's kind of purpose there. It's all web GUI console, so you can access it from your workstation. You don't have to remote into servers as long as you have those ports opened and you can actually communicate to the Enterprise Manager server. I can't recall what port it uses off the top, but if you have any questions regarding that, there is a default port, and obviously you can change that default port to something else that you want as well. When we are in the Enterprise Manager, this is just kind of the dashboard overview of how things are going on the Veeam servers. So, you'll see how many backup servers it's monitoring, how many jobs, machines, file shares. You're going to see just kind of a rough, how much image data, file data, and how jobs have been running for the last 24 hours. There's also a 7-day there, so you can click on that as well and see how those jobs are running, or how they ran for the last 7 days. Under the Jobs tab here, you have a few options. You can run a full backup of a job. You can disable jobs, you can clone the job, or you can delete them. In some cases, obviously, you can edit these jobs as well. But if you're creating a new job, in most cases, you will have to get into that Veeam server and launch that the creation of the jobs. I guess one option you could do here is you could clone something and kind of configure it that way. But in most cases, it may just be easier to launch the Veeam console and hop in there and do everything you're going to do. And then obviously come back to Enterprise Manager and you'll see and be able to monitor all those things again. Under the Machines tab here, this is basically just going to be for recovering. So we're seeing obviously the machine name, what server it's attached to, what job it's a part of, and how many restore points we have. So obviously you can click on those hyperlinks and you can go through those restore points. You can do instant recovery from here. You could do your entire VM restore. You could add these to a failover plan, as well as there's the unstructured data tab there, as well as the files that you can do your guest restores and file restores of that nature. If you click on the items tab here, this is going to be for anything that is application recovery. So if you have like an on-prem Exchange server and you're running application aware processing, which we'll talk about here in a little bit as well, if you're not familiar, or SQL databases, Oracle database, Postgres instances, you would be able to go ahead and restore those as well. We do have a configuration button at the top right. This is going to allow for some administrator changes and configuration. So right off the bat here, we're going to see, if this was a fresh install, you wouldn't have a backup server in here. So the first thing you're going to do is go into that configuration and you're going to add your backup servers. So obviously, like I said, they collect the data, sees the server configuration to see all the jobs, and you would just be adding multiple servers one by one there. From the vCenter aspect, you can see your vCenter servers. That can be integrated into your setup. You'll be able to see the version, plugin statuses, and obviously the status of those servers. The self-service portal here. So this will just basically allow, you would be delegating users to have access to something. In this example here, we can, obviously the names are blanked out there, but you can see they have access to certain repositories. Now there's, if you want to add a user, you would, you just click on add. You could add a user, you could add a group, you would add which repository they can have access to, and just basically the scope of what you want them to be able to restore there. Let's jump down to licensing here. So if you have more than one Veeam server, or if you're just curious to know what is being backed up, you'll obviously, from the configuration, you have the licensing tab. If you click on this report button, it'll break it out for you to go through and show you how many instances are being used, what they're being used for, so you can kind of keep tabs on that. If I go back here a little bit, you'll see obviously at the bottom there the instances, like cloud machines, there's 12 of them, right? So it kind of breaks that out, so you just have the knowledge of what your instances are being used for. If there's for some reason a discrepancy, this list will help you verify, oh, this is being backed up all of a sudden when it shouldn't be. Maybe it was like a test environment or something like that. So that's pretty much Enterprise Manager in short. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the Q&A. We'll jump over here to the main menu of the VBR console. So let's just talk about the credentials aspect first here. You can use this option to create and maintain a list of credentials records that you plan to use to connect, obviously, components into your backup infrastructure. So we have the data center credentials. This is going to include your on-site data center credentials for servers, workstations, hypervisors, storage systems, etc. there. Our cloud credentials, that's going to be any compute and storage accounts. So if you're connecting Azure or AWS or Google, if you needed to do a restore to that, you could already have those credentials already loaded, ready to go. And, you could restore things to those services. The same thing is if you wanted to start backing up services like that. Obviously, if you already have the storage account and compute and everything accounts set up already, then you would be able to see into that infrastructure and you could do backups. Encryption passwords. So this is going to be for your configuration backup as well as the job backup encryption if you enable it through there. If for any reason, obviously the if you need to change an encryption password or anything from there, and I guess I don't think I talked about that on Enterprise Manager, but if you lose an encryption password, Enterprise Manager, I'll just kind of reference that, also can be used for if you lose your encryption password, if you're encrypting things with Veeam. So in that event, Enterprise Manager is really handy at, giving you that extra resource if you needed to unlock your configuration database, or if you needed to restore a server and you were losing your encryption password of some sort. But all those passwords will be stored there. And then we have the key management servers. This will be an option you can add for a key management server, and you'll be able to use those KMS keys that you've created there. Let's go through the users and roles category here. So from the main menu, we'll go to users and roles, and we will see all of the the security tab and the authorization tab. So by default, you'll see a built-in administrators. That's going to be pretty much the first thing you're going to see when you load Veeam for the first time. If you click add, you can add users or user groups, and you can give them specific roles. So obviously, if we go ahead and hit that we want to, add a user, you would just click browse or type in their name, and then you would give them the roles. So the roles goes as pretty much as follow. We have the restore operator, a backup operator, a backup administrator, tape operator, and a backup viewer. So the restore operator is basically just going to allow you to restore. It's not going to have any management options besides just doing a restore. Those backup operators, you can start and stop backup jobs, and you can export those jobs with Veeam zips, or you can create Veeam zips rather, and you can copy those jobs. An administrator, you're just being able to perform everything that you need to do. If you need to add more things to the infrastructure, you will be able to do that all right there within this window, and give that option to a specific user. A tape operator, obviously, we talked about tapes briefly earlier, but this is just for anyone. If you have a tape genius there, you can give them that role of they're in charge of tapes, and they have all that access to those tape operations. And then we also have the backup viewer. This is if you just want to give someone read-only access to the console, so they can log in from time to time and see how things have been running. From here, we'll go back to the main menu, and we'll look at the global network rules. So from the main menu, we have network traffic rules, and from here, you can set up throttling if you were running jobs during a workday, and you didn't want to tank the network for some reason. You would be able to go through and set those time periods. You can also choose to limit those upload streams per job. I can't recall if that was unchecked by default, or if it's checked with just like a low number like 4 or something. But you have that option to go ahead and just limit what you need to do there. So obviously, that would be for if you're having, let's just say, 50 jobs all running around the same time. It's going to take a pretty big hit on the network. So having those limitations could be good in those aspects. You can add different IPv4 and 6 rules. So you can specify preferred networks. You can add those ranges for enforcing or either encrypting that network traffic during those specified periods. And obviously, also the throttling is enabled there. Here we're going to go ahead, and this is the preferred networks. So, if you wanted your network traffic to use a specific traffic, you would be able to come in here and add those. Otherwise, it's going to be using whatever the VBR server network is attached to. All right, let's see. VM exclusions from the main menu. If you wanted to do any VM exclusions, we can do this. So obviously we offer the possibility to add your virtual machines to an exclusion list, so it'll never be processed accidentally or something. We'll see this used for maybe environments that you're backing up a handful of things and you just want to make sure that something might not uh, be overlooked and start backing up and utilizing licenses that maybe you don't have. So they won't be processed by any jobs. The only jobs they could be processed by would be those backup copy jobs or a SureBackup job, because you can go ahead and just do a SureBackup job and do your verification checks. Obviously, if you needed to start backing those up, just take notes. You would have to remove those from the list prior to being able to add them to a backup job and having them processed. Back to the main menu here. We have this options button. The options is kind of a very good start to be in. Obviously, we have these I/O controls, so you can control the latency of your production data stores during that data protection and disaster recovery activities. You can always use this to like monitor those storage latencies. You can stop and assign new tasks stop assigning new tasks to data store at the IO limitation period. So you know it, if you do set up those limitations, then VBR isn't going to assign any new tasks targeted at that data store. The IO latency limit. If you must decrease that speed of data retrieval, you would be able to do that there. Moving over to the email settings tab here. It's always, definitely good to have, uh, you know, making sure your backups are successful. Email may be a little overkill, but some people like it. Most people that I've worked with will set up warnings and failures. So obviously, if you come in the morning, you will get a notification if a backup failed or not. So easy enough to just go there, set up your SMTP server, or Gmail or 365. Add in everything, send a test message to yourself, make sure it's pairing correctly, and then you will start getting those daily reports and being notified on those jobs. Notifications tab here. So I don't recall if these are off all by default. I believe they're checked, and it might be at 10%. But if your backup storage is getting low, in this case below 10%, it would shoot you a warning. Obviously, if you don't fix that or remedy something, then those backups may start failing, because prior to Veeam running, we look at the storage repository, and if it's too full, then your backups won't go. Or if it tries to send a backup to it and it runs out of space, then the backup job will abort, and you could have some corruption of some sort, potentially. So definitely keep those notifications on for those backup storage, as well as production data stores. You can enable for when your support contract expiration. So when you log into the console, it'll say you have 60 days left before you need to renew your support. Update notifications. Obviously, whenever there's a product and hypervisor updates, it's just checking those and alerting when those become available. Then we have a history tab here. This session basically just controls how many entries should be visible in your history tab. Keep this in mind. Obviously, this could go ahead and increase your database store. So if you're using like SQL Express or something where it has that limitation, we don't want to get that filled up all the way. But you can definitely go ahead and edit these as much as needed. Then let's go ahead and we'll go back to the main menu and we will look at the console button. I always forget about this sometimes, but it is there. If you want to run PuTTY, Swagger, PowerShell, or just RDP, you can open those within the VBR console itself. Definitely good for running those PowerShell commands if needed. Swagger, that's for anything regarding your REST APIs, obviously RDP, and PuTTY to maybe SSH into something. But all just, right there and readily available for you. From this main menu, we'll talk about the configuration backup. This one's super important, so it's definitely good to see this one. First things first, you do have the, well, I guess let me just explain what the configuration backup is. So it's storing all of the changes that were made inside of the Veeam console. If for some reason this VBR server crashes, in that configuration backup, you would just be, you have a configuration backup. You could use that quickly to restore everything to a new Veeam server that you spun up and installed Veeam on. Or if you're doing any like server migrations, it's going to make your life a lot easier to just do a restore and migrate the database over to a new Veeam server. Very important. By default, when this is set up, it will choose a default repository. And default repository in most cases is your local C drive. So we strongly advise to put a configuration backup onto a repository that's not local, something you could access in case this Veeam server did go down. You can choose how many restore points you want to keep, and you can also, by default, it's going off daily at 10 o'clock. Really not a big impact. You can change that to whatever time you would like, but it usually takes about a minute to maybe 3 minutes to run those, depending on your database size. And then obviously there are email notifications for that. So if it for some reason fails or whatnot, then you would be able to, get in there and just click the backup now and get a recent backup of it. So enabling the configuration backup file encryption. So this is good. If that encryption password's lost, obviously, like I said, the enterprise manager can assist in retrieving it and doing that restore. If you don't have this set up as encryption, it doesn't take any passwords or anything into the database. So keep that in mind. If it is encrypted, the passwords and stuff will transfer over. It's going to be a lot easier for you to, get things back up and running instead of typing in password after password. So highly advise that you encrypt that anyways. And the loss protection is obviously that added bonus that, like I said, if you lost the password for some reason, Enterprise Manager can help you. So I kind of talked about the restore capabilities here. If if it went down, you would come in here, click restore, it would be highlighted for you, and then you would just add that configuration backup to it. And then there's also a migrate option, and that would be used for possibly moving the VBR server from one to another. All right, so if there's any questions about that, please feel free to put those into the chat and we will happily be able to assist you there. We're getting into our biggest topic here, and that's jobs. Lots and lots about jobs. So hopefully you sit back and enjoy this one. Obviously, a lot of questions may come up. Feel free to reach out to the Q&A and we can get those answered or some documentation over to you. So we, obviously it's like the bread and butter, the jobs is what you're here for. So, we have those backup jobs, we have replication jobs, and then we also have the restore operations. So once those jobs are configured, we'll automate that process for you, ensuring that your backups are going and are protected against any loss or corruption. So yeah, obviously we have the handful there. So obviously the probably the most common in most cases is just going to be a backup job. And then following the 3-2-1, we like to see backup copy job of some sort. Sending your data to another location as well. Replication jobs are definitely a go-to if you wanted to keep things, in kind of in a ready state, so you can just fail over. SureBackup jobs, I know we talked about those earlier. That's for going through and doing, um, you know, recovery verification tests. And then we have the CDP policy jobs. That's going to be our continuous data protection. So that's going to be down to, in theory, the seconds. If you needed to recover, faster, you would be able to go ahead and set up those CDP jobs. This is going to be a VMware only option at the moment, so just keep that in mind. But the whole purpose is keeping high critical profile servers readily available. So if something were to happen, you're not losing out on a very active database or something like that. All right, so job prioritization here. So kind of just like a simplified list here. Data restore jobs, uh, you know, for how jobs are being handled, restores are always going to be the highest priority. So any resources that's being used from the Veeam server, if a restore is being taken place, that's getting the highest priority. Because obviously if you're restoring something means, something may be going on and we're going to help you get that information back. So it's going to be, obviously a higher priority than like maybe sending things to an archive tier. Not to say those aren't a priority, but it's just down the chain a little bit. When you set up jobs, you also have a high priority flag on jobs. So you can always check that, and then your job will have a little flag indication on it, letting you know that that is a high priority job. All right. So this is basically just kind of details of how the backup process works. So when a new backup job session starts, it starts the backup manager process. And the backup manager reads that job settings from the configuration database, just like that. And it creates a list of machines it needs to process. After that, the backup manager connects to the backup service. It includes the resources, scheduling, things like that. And it checks what components are available to assign to those proxies. Then, when we connect them to the proxies, we connect them to the transport services afterwards. And then it launches to the data mover process, which will be following your traffic rules. It'll be doing your encryption, etc. And then after that, we're querying information about the virtual machines and hosts. If you enabled application aware processing, we connect it into the guest OS to perform those tasks, which I will be touching base in here a little bit as well. But then the data mover and the proxy on the proxy uses those transport modes. It reads that data and does the compression, and it sends the data to a repository. Once it's finished, Veeam will go ahead and do its cleanup. Obviously, if there is any, if calls a snapshot or a checkpoint, it will do the cleanup after that and delete those snapshots. So that's kind of the overview of how that functions with the services talking to each other in the configuration database, as well as going through the proxies and getting all that information ready. Now, maybe I make it sound longer than it is. It's fairly quick to do these all on its own. You know, you just basically have the job scheduled and it'll do it all. It gets it right. If you ever follow the job process, it says that it's getting it ready, it's finding the proxies, and then, you know, then it'll start sending data. So it's relatively quick. So how to create a backup job. So from the top menu, you'll see that backup. You'll go ahead and click what you need. So in this case, we're just going to do a virtual machine. So we're going to name it, add a description. Like I said, there's the high priority flag. If you needed to set a job as high priority to get it up on that list a little bit more. I always recommend adding a decent description to jobs, just so then at a glance you know what's what. But then we'll go ahead, and the next page is where we're going to add those virtual machines. So you can add those objects from hosts and clusters. You can add them from those VMs and templates. You can add them from your data stores, or a very popular is like VMware tagging, to go ahead and you know, if it, for instance, I like to mention, if you do like a SQL tag and all the SQL servers are in that tag, obviously any new SQL server that pops up should in theory get that tag when you are creating it in VMware there, and automatically will start getting backed up after the fact. Here's a combination of just those VM tags as well. Now, with those tags and stuff like that, if you needed to exclude anything, we also have that option to just go ahead and, you know, go through and exclude those VMs. You can exclude certain disks. So maybe you don't want, maybe you want to back up all the disks on a server besides like a system drive or something. You only want to back up disks that are file shares or something of that nature. You could come in here and you know, process those as needed. Same thing with templates. You can exclude templates from incremental backups and such like that. The next tab is regarding the storage screen here. And this is where a lot of things happen. So by default, the backup proxy is always set up as automatic selection. I know when we talked about proxies earlier, we talked about adding proxies. By default, the Veeam server is a proxy. So in most cases, it can be pretty well. You just want to make sure you go in there and, you know, do those concurrent tasks and stuff. But if you have a bunch of proxies and you want to dedicate a specific proxy to a job, you could do so here. So you would just be able to click choose, and then instead of automatic selection, use the selected backup proxy servers only, and go through and select which servers you want to process that job. By default, automatic's always going to be picking the most suitable server or backup proxy server for, you know, out of all the servers. So if, let's just say, proxy 123 is just getting hounded by other jobs, proxy 4 is available, it would use proxy 4. Now, if you specified proxy 123 on this job and those were already used, then this job would be sitting there in queue waiting for a proxy you know, tasks to become available before processing. So just keep that in mind. From there, we have the backup repository. So this is basically just saying, you know, where you want that backup to go. When you created that repository earlier, you would just be specifying that. We also have the retention policy. So this could be in days or retention points. So retention points would be used maybe if you were doing like a backup every 4 hours. Maybe you didn't want, you know, all of those restore points for 14 days in this example. So you could just have a retention policy based on restore points. And then from there, for any archive purposes, we have GFS. grandfather, father, son, where you can, specify longer term retentions based on your needs. So if you wanted to do weeklies, monthlies, or yearlies, and have those archived, you could definitely specify that here. In the advanced window here, we have a lot of choices. So the first one that we're greeted with is the backup mode. Reverse incremental, I'll kind of touch base on that. It keeps being told it's going to be depreciated soon, but keep that in mind. But basically what it's doing is your latest backup is always a full backup. So it just keeps injecting those incrementals into a full backup every day. So if you choose that mode, that is what it would be. So incremental. Now there's two ways to do this. We have forever forward incremental. So that would be where the first backup is a full, and then afterwards it is just incrementals. Obviously, this could be useful for, if you don't have a lot of space, because it will take less space and you're going to have more quick backup times. But, obviously you're going to be, on that same backup chain. With synthetic fulls and active fulls, this kind of resets that backup chain. And we do get questions on what's the difference between the two. Basically, a synthetic full is where Veeam Backup Server doesn't retrieve the VM data from the source data store if you do a synthetic full. Basically, what it's doing is it synthesizes the full backup of data you already have in your backup repository. And it creates a new synthetic full backup containing the same data obviously new data, but it writes it into a new full backup file. So this is happening in the repository itself. Whereas an active full is Veeam does go out and retrieves the VM data from the source data store where that VM is residing, and then it compresses it, it dedupes it, and then it writes it into the VBK file format, and then puts it in the backup repository. So I guess it could be maybe, obviously an active full is going to be more so going over the network then, whereas synthetic full is just building everything within the repository alone. Now, just keep this in mind, I guess, just as a note. If you were using like maybe a NAS or something for a repository, maybe synthetic full may not be the best for you just because it does use a lot of resources to build that synthetic full. So maybe an active full would perform better for you. Obviously, any questions or concerns about that, just let us know in the Q&A, and we can address those. Moving over to the maintenance tab here, we have storage level corruption guard. This basically performs a test of the latest recovery points. It's checking for any form of corruption. It alerts you if it finds anything, but in most cases, it will heal the corruption automatically and kind of move on. I believe it still does give you a warning, just kind of letting you know, but definitely good to, test those backups from that level, at least once a month. The full backup file maintenance. This is going to be, okay. Remove deleted items data after, in this case, 3 days. So it's basically saying how long should data be retained for deleted VMs? So by default, this isn't checked. So you will need to go in and check this. It will, if a VM's not a part of the backup job anymore, or maybe you turned it off or whatnot, it will go through and clean up that data after the days you mentioned. instead of just sitting out there. Because obviously, if you remove a job from or just turn off a server or something, those backups more than likely are going to just stay in the repository and potentially have extra data that you don't need. So this is just one of those things for making sure things are clean. So defragment and compact full backup files. This process, obviously helps with space, but only really if you're doing forever forward incremental. It doesn't really apply to any jobs with scheduled fulls. So if you're utilizing forever incremental, this will help from that aspect. Moving forward to the storage tab, dedupe. So this is enabled by default, all of these. Veeam will try to dedupe the data. Obviously, that the expense that you may get a performance reduction potentially. In most cases, if you are sending data to a dedupe device, you would want to uncheck this, because then obviously the dedupe hardware is doing the dedupe, and takes the load off of the proxy. Plus, you're going to get better dedupe ratios with a dedupe device, anyways. Swap file block. So excluding swap file block. Sorry. Basically, we're checking on Windows machines. The NTFS MFT file, it targets two files. There's a hibernation file and a swap file. The swap file is dynamic. It changes intensively between backup job sessions. So excluding this file results in smaller incremental backups and replicas. However, if you want to back it up, you would just go in there and uncheck it. Excluding deleted file blocks. So Veeam doesn't copy any dirty deleted blocks. It's best to leave that checked. So you're not, copying anything over that it doesn't need to be copied over anymore. Compression levels. So this one has a handful of different levels that you can choose from. Optimal is on by default. There's a good balance here. It's providing good compression, keeping the performance. It's not impacting the proxies as much. But if you needed a little bit more bang for your buck, we do have some higher and extreme compression ratios, which I'll mention here. But there's also one that's dedupe friendly. So obviously, if you're going to a dedupe device, like I kind of mentioned before, you would change this compression level to dedupe friendly. Or I guess when maybe like a WAN Accelerator or something is used, could be helpful there for a dedupe friendly. The high ratio, though, if you did the drop down here and chose high, it provides about 60% additional data reduction, but at the cost of the CPU usage of the proxy is about 2 times as high than it usually is. Now keep this in mind: when you compress something even more, the restore can also be impacted. So we usually just say plan on, if you did a high compression, the restore will be about 2 times slower than what it would have been on optimal. Then we also have an extreme compression level. So that gives you an additional 33% over the high compression. So high compression already had 60%. So we'll do an additional 33. That comes with the cost of the CPU usage being about 5 times higher, and of course, slower restores. But if you were needing space, that is something that you could go through and change those compression levels if needed. In most cases, like I said, optimal is basically what it is. It's optimal. So storage optimization. So this is the dedupe block size Veeam uses for a job. So there's 4 settings in here. The 1 megabyte is recommended. This is for like backups going to like a SAN or local storage. It's providing faster job performance. We also have like 4 megabyte, so that's going to be for files that are larger than 16 terabytes. It's giving you the lowest dedupe ratio and the largest size of incremental files, but it's optimized from that aspect. We also have a 512 kilobytes. It's recommended for like going to a NAS, an on-site backup and replication. You're getting a better dedupe ratio and reduces the size of the files. And then we have a 256 KB. It's recommended if you plan to use WAN for offsite backup and replication. That's maximizing your dedupe ratio, and it's going to have the smallest size files. So when you're sending over the WAN, you're not sending larger files. Now, we see best performance in that. Moving forward there, we have encryption. So I kind of talked about this earlier. If you want Veeam to encrypt those files at rest, we can handle this. It may take a hit on performance. In most cases, it's best to use a hardware encryption, but we do have this available. It's obviously recommended that you encrypt your backup one way or another. If you are just going to a box that doesn't do any encryption, I would say check this, dedicate a encryption password. And then when I talked about Enterprise Manager earlier, if you lost that encryption password, you could fall back if you set up the encryption password within Enterprise Manager to go ahead and do those restores with that password as well. I know that was a lot, so definitely make sure you use the Q&A. I know we got about 40 minutes left here, so I was just trying not to talk super fast, but there's definitely a lot of information here. Notifications. So I kind of talked about this earlier under the main menu. That's a global notification setting. So you want to make sure you set up the global settings, but you can also tailor jobs to send to specific people instead of following the global aspect. So I'll just pick on a SQL job. So let's just say you'll do a SQL job, and you want to alert the DBA team when the backup finished every night. You could go in there and you could send those notifications to those, the members of the DBA team. So then they know that the job was finished, and they can receive an email about it. The successful backup details information. This is, this is basically just, just backup results. It's going to give you the backup date and time. It's going to give you the server name, the path of the backup, to a VM attribute. In the field under the checkbox, you can enter the name of an attribute. If the specified attribute does not exist, Veeam will create it. Let's move over to the vSphere tab here. So guest quiescence here. To back up a running machine, we must freeze it for a second or two to achieve, a consistent state for data integrity, data safety. We recommend using application-aware processing, but if the option is disabled or unavailable, then you can use the native tool. So you can, by default, I don't think that's checked, but it may be worth just double checking. Change block tracking. So for VMware, CBT version 7 Plus, which tracks data blocks since the last job. This is on by default. And then if you're a Hyper-V environment, I believe it's called resilient change tracking. It's all going to be working in that matter there. The reset CBT on each full. This is best practice just because the CBT reset provides safety of potential CBT issues. If it was reporting maybe inaccurate data, you will just reset it to a fresh slate every full. So definitely keep that in mind. The integration, we covered this bit previously when we did the storage integration part, but if you want to use storage integration, you can enable the from storage snapshot here. You can limit the count, also have the failovers in place just in case something was wrong. I know Chris talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is in the job setting where you would go through and enable those. Yeah, I always mention usually, and I believe Chris did too, is just do a failover to standard backup just in case. So then scripts, you can run post and pre-scripts if you need to do anything prior to the job or after the job. So this would be useful if maybe you needed to turn off. I mean, it's kind of use case, but maybe you have like a service runs that maybe conflict with something, so you stop that service prior to running the job, and then after the job you just turn it back on. Whatever it may be, you have the ability to do any sort of custom scripting that you would like before or after the job. And obviously you can run those scripts on selected days only, or however many times you want to run that script during the backup session. All right, guest processing tab. So I know you've probably heard me mention application aware processing a few times, but when you enable this, you go into this applications and edit the server. So you can see here, obviously we just selected a server. If we hit edit, this processing settings will pop up. So this is more so for, the SQL's aspect. Under the general tab here, we can see you can choose require successful processing to halt the backup if any issues during the application aware processing. Like if the VSS writer is not in a stable state, it'll halt it as your first option there. Second option is the try it but ignore. So that just ensures that your backup job is finishing even if the application processing fails. So you still get a crash consistent backup. And then the third option is you can disable processing on a machine if it doesn't need to run it. So if you were grouping something and maybe the SQLs or a domain controller or something weren't in or were in a job with other servers and you needed application aware processing, you could go through here and just exclude those so they don't run or try to run more so. The VSS setting, this is transaction logs. If you want Veeam to handle the application logs, you can choose these options. So the first option is automatically truncates logs or process transaction logs with the job. If you're using a native backup tool, it's best to check with a DBA or something to make sure you don't truncate something they're already doing and causing an internal conflict there. So always, definitely, if you enable this, just so you know, Veeam by default will start truncating logs. So keep that in mind. We usually only say, use one tool should handle the logs. Persistent guest agent. If you prefer Veeam to use persistent agent from AppAware, then you can enable this. So these agents use a couple of specific ports compared to non-consistent that we use by default. Obviously, more information can be given to you from the Q&A there. SQL tab here. So obviously we, like I said, by default, truncate logs is enabled, so you can truncate them and have Veeam do it. But like I said, if you want, if you're already doing it native SQL way, you say don't truncate those logs and just do a copy mode. The other thing is you can back up those logs periodically. So this is for point in time restores for your transaction logs. Veeam can restore them, take a transaction log backup every 15 minutes by default, or every 60 minutes, whatever you may do. You can retain those backups for X amount of days, or you can just have it follow the image level backups. Oracle, pretty much the same thing regarding the logs. If you want Veeam to keep archive logs, delete them after X amount of time or over a specific gigabyte, or also then again back up those logs, based on the minutes you provide there. Postgres, again, you can do the same thing, create transactionally consistent backup of PostgreSQL VM. This will define the WAL files for processing. Exclusions, you can exclude files or folders, if you don't want them to look at that. There's wildcards that you can use in here. So if there's something specific, you can use like something such as an asterisk to exclude a handful of things in one go instead of typing out everything individually. And then we have scripts. So like I said, if you plan to run applications that do not support VSS, you can specify what scripts VBR must use to quest the VM. The pre-freeze script quests the VM file system and application data to bring the VM to a consistent state, basically before the VBR triggers a VM snapshot. Then after that VM snapshot is created, then you can do a post-auth script to bring the VMs and applications to their initial state. So that's kind of what that could be used for. Guest file indexing, and also with 12.1 is malware scanning. So this is just create a catalog of files located on the guest OS. Enables easy one-click restores of individual files. When I talked about Enterprise Manager earlier, I know that kind of piggybacks. You can go there and search for a file name. And ease of use for file browsing and searching. You could go there and John deleted a backup or deleted a file, don't know what day, but knows the name. Instead of you mounting each individual backup for the past week, you could just search and see which one, the backup or that file lived on. So, or obviously it's Enterprise Manager, so you can just click it and say restore. So it can be super handy there. Now, obviously, I always like to mention this guest file system indexing and malware detection can contribute to longer backups just because it has to catalog everything. In most cases, though, it usually the first run, it kind of takes a while just because it hasn't done it before. And then after that, I usually say treat it kind of like an incremental where it would be cataloging things that have changed. So moving on to the guest interaction proxy, you can specify interaction proxy settings that VBR will use to install non-persistent runtime components, or use, I guess, if necessary, install persistent agent components in each VM. The guest OS credentials, obviously, if you're using application or processing, you have to specify a credential for us to use so we can see into that OS. And then you can click the test now button and make sure prior to setting up that job and trying to run it that the credentials actually worked or had the right permissions. So test now button is very good to have. And then obviously we have the schedule portion of the job here. You run job automatically, daily, monthly, periodically. You can set up the retry times. By default, it's 3, and it waits 10 minutes before each retry attempt. And then the backup window here, you can set up a window where the job is allowed to run. So by default, everything's permitted. If you check that and click on the window button, this screen would pop up. A little confusing at first. Green is permitted. You would have to click on denied and then just kind of highlight areas you don't want the backup jobs to run. So just keep that in mind. In this example, we're just doing like a working hours where we're not letting backup jobs run. Now keep in mind, if a job is taking too long that night and it's still wanting to go into the next morning, it will be forced to stop just because you are not allowing it to run then. So maybe do network throttling like I mentioned a while back would be helpful potentially. It could definitely help out with having backups maybe that are bleeding over if they're running too long. So then on the summary time here, we can check that box that says run when the job is finished, if you want it to launch automatically right away, or otherwise it won't run until the specified time. It also has a PowerShell command there for you, just so if you ever were curious of how to start something from the PowerShell, it does list it there. I was planning on a break, but I feel like we're making pretty good time there. So maybe we'll jump right into the restores. We're kind of on the downhill here. Jobs was kind of the big portion. So let's just continue on if everyone's good with that. There's a handful of ways that we can do, I guess, restores. It's obviously to reduce the time to however you need to do a restore. So we have numerous ways. Entire VM instant recovery, you can restore just virtual disks. Instant disk recovery, you can do your VM file restore, guest file restore, application restores, and of course we can restore to like Google, Amazon, Azure, Nutanix, if you were moving things from like VMware to Nutanix and you included the Nutanix environment into the Veeam console, you could also do a restore to Nutanix. You can export those contents as virtual disks and you can publish those disks. So those are kind of the restore methods there. So let's talk about I guess a few on how they're working. Instant recovery. So obviously lets you recover a VM from backup file with the lowest recovery time possible. So this is used obviously in emergencies. Every minute counts. You need to resume operations quick as possible. This is where this would be used. So let's go ahead. Veeam mounts a data store on the selected ESXi host using a vPower NFS service. Under this data store, Veeam copies the configuration file and other files, and these set of files are sufficient for VMware to register and start the VM. The VM disks themselves remain on the repository, and Veeam reads data from them. During the actual recovery, we don't copy them, we are just referring to it. Hopefully that hopefully I didn't go too quick there. But next, after you are doing that, comes the registration. So we're going to create the snapshot of the VM that saves all write operations and start the VM. It is running in just a few minutes, right? To fully complete the recovery, though, you will need to do a data migration process. So the actual data transfer starts when you start the recovery. So that's kind of the how instant recovery is working, just to get those critical servers back up and running with as much minimal downtime as possible. So like I said, please feel free to ask any Q&As on the restore processes as we go through this. The restore to Amazon EC2, Azure, or Google. Before you can do this, you'll need to set up a subscription, deployed virtual network, and a storage account. So when I talked about the main menu earlier and we went through those password credentials, you could do this beforehand. But if you don't, when you go to do the restore, you're going to be prompted to provide them beforehand anyways. So it could just save you a step. With this feature, though, you can recover those VMs to the cloud. You can migrate from on-prem to the cloud if you're going to do a migration. However you want to get something over to the cloud, you can go ahead and do that. There is a helper appliance that it can be set up in this process. It helps a lot with the restore performances to the cloud restores. So it's not needed, but you well, if you're doing a restore and every minute counts, that's going to help a lot. And that would be set up in when you're doing the restore, there's an option to do the helper appliance. So let's talk about the guest file restore here. Instead of restoring an entire VM, sometimes you just want to restore a file. So without actually restoring the entire VM, which takes time, just simply do the guest file restore. You can restore from Windows, Linux, Mac. During the Windows guest restore, basically Windows creates a mount point to mount the VM disk from the backup or replica that you are restoring from. It opens up a Veeam Explorer, and it'll show you all the content and the mounted drives. So then you just easily browse and restore those files. You can restore to original location. You can copy them somewhere else. You can compare with production. There's just a handful of options that you can do, but very fast and efficient to just restore files instead of a whole entire VM just for a file. So that's definitely widely used, I feel like. Next, we have the application item restores. So kind of the same thing. In the picture here, we're kind of referencing a Exchange mailbox. So if you had an on-prem Exchange server and you were using application or application-aware processing, then we can see into that Exchange and we can skip that whole process and just go ahead and restore Exchange mailbox items in this case. Same thing can be done with Active Directory, SQL servers, Oracle, Postgres. You can go ahead and just simply restore a table. If you were doing the transaction logs and stuff, you could actually, restore back to a time point in time as well. But it's skipping that process and basically just letting you do those restores so you don't have to go ahead and boot everything up. Now, a couple of these other ones that like Microsoft Teams, Microsoft OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, things like that. Now, that would be obviously from like our second product, which would be Veeam for Microsoft 365, which you could do those restores there as well. So yeah, definitely some ease of use there. And this is kind of what the Explorer would look like in this case. You could restore item, you can export them, you could search for items, compare them with production, things like that. And just a couple options on where you could restore those from. So how do you restore a VM? So real quick, let's just talk about the flow of how to restore a VM. So under the left side, you'll see under backups, it says disk copy, disk orphan, object storage capacity, tier, cloud, tape, all of that. That's one way to do it. Or you can just click on the top left backup and choose entire VM. If you wanted to restore something from on-prem, you could just easily go into that disk there on the left, and then you'll see all your job names. You can expand the job you need, and then you can just right click on it and you'll see those tables there. So restore entire VM is highlighted. Once we get into that, you will see the window where you can again add more VMs, but you can also choose which recovery point you want to restore from. So, if you needed to go back a week or two, just depending on your retention policy, you could restore what you needed. So after you choose which virtual machines you want to restore, then we have the restore mode. So obviously you can restore to its original location. Obviously, all the previous settings and stuff are going to stay the same, just because it lived there before. But you could also do a restore to a new location or with different settings, which we'll go through here in a minute. But then we also have staged restore. So this option executes a script on a VM before the actual restore. So you can write a script that can be pretty much anything. Maybe you want to delete sensitive data prior to the restore or update software. You could do a staged restore at that point. Oh, and real quick on the restore to original location, if you choose that, you can select this quick rollback feature. And that's just used to identify and roll back only the changed data blocks necessary to restore to the selected state. So I would say avoid using the quick rollback if it was related to, like, let's if the server was down due to a hardware failure or a storage issue or a power loss or something. It's pretty much only intended for maybe like software issues. But that option, that is kind of what it is for there. So moving on to the restore to a new location, if we select that and hit next, you'll see all of these new categories on the left side, so such as host, resource pool, data store, folder, network, all of those. So we're going to be choosing which host or cluster where the VM should be registered to. From there, you can choose the resource pool if needed, and then from there we can select the data store. You can choose to do different data stores for different disks, but obviously. You can also change the disk type here, kind of what I just brought up, where Veeam's always going to restore the defaults of what the disk was originally formatted as, but you can modify that, thick to thin or thin to thick when you do a recovery. Otherwise, it's always going to be same as source. Next, we're going to just update the name. If you need to, maybe put dash restored or something behind it, just in case that server is still on and you don't want a conflict. You can also change the folder. And you can also choose to if you want to restore it with like VM tags. After that, we have the networking portion. So we have our source network that we see, and then obviously if you're restoring this to a new location, you're going to want to specify that location's networking. So map the network, or if you wanted to just turn on the VM without any networking, you can just disconnect it from network altogether so it doesn't join anything, and you can do that after the fact. The secure restore option. So you can scan these restore points with a AV engine or following like a Yara rule. There are scan options you can choose. Obviously, if malware is found, you can say proceed with recovery, but disable the networking just in case something was going to bleed over on the new side. Obviously we don't want that. We want to contain it. Or you can just, abort the recovery altogether. You can also do continue scanning all remaining files after the first occurrence. So then you have a scan for the entire VM instead of just stopping at the first sign of something. The restore reason. So these are all recorded in the log, so you can just look back and see, why you restored something. So definitely always nice, and best practices to put something in there. So if someone's looking, someone else is in the Veeam console and looking, why did we do a restore on something? The documentation is there. After that, you can choose to, power on the VM after it's restored, or you can, do that manually after. But that is the checkbox there where you can enable that. Let's see here. Next up, we're going to talk about security. Is everyone still good with continuing on, or should we do a 10-minute break here? I know we kind of talked about a lot there, but no reactions there. Okay. We'll continue on with the security aspect. I don't recall. I don't think this one is super terribly long. If you are on version 12.1, maybe you've seen it, but we do have a button under the home menu where we are talking about security and compliance. So this is just following best practice trends for infrastructure security as well as our product configuration. So like I said, from the home menu, you would just be able to click on that button right there. Once you click on that button, it'll go ahead and pop up this list. It takes a minute to analyze the environment, but afterwards it will spit out something similar to this. So basically the list is going to be showing you what's passing or what's not passing, or not implemented rather. And what the recommended should be, to get a passing grade there. So you can go through these manually and address them. I guess, for example, like RDP is turned on when it, in a perfect world, best case scenario, locking things down shouldn't be enabled in most cases. But some services are on that maybe you typically don't need, such as like remote registry or I guess some other things like SMBv1 protocol should be disabled is a good one. Just because those are points where like ransomware viruses and stuff like that were coming in from. So definitely some good information there to make sure things are implemented and passing. From the product configuration standpoint, we're looking at things such as like MFA, if it's enabled, immutable backups, password loss protection from Enterprise Manager if you're using Enterprise Manager, and just making sure things are following like a 3-2-1 rule, getting those backup copies and such. So definitely good information here. You can run this on a schedule, and I kind of advise that if you go through the list and get it, suppress things that you don't want to disable, such as like RDP in some cases, so then it's not reporting that. But getting the schedule in there and running it, so then if something is added to it, you get a notification that maybe something's not implemented again. It could be a new feature from an update, or maybe something was passing before and now all of a sudden it's not again. So just keeping up on those security aspects is a good thing. Okay. Let's see here. So I know I talked about MFA from that last list there. So obviously with version 12 and higher, we built in MFA into the console. So in order to enable this, you have to go to the menu and then users and roles. MFA is not currently supported for groups. You can't enable it when groups are in there. So I think by default, earlier I said it looked like the backup administrator or just administrators was in there. So just keep that in mind. You would have to remove groups first and then add individual users and give them their respective roles. So once all of the users are set up, you can then click the enable multi-factor authentication at the bottom there. And after you enable it, when users sign into the Veeam UI, they'll be presented with a QR code. And obviously, use your MFA authorization and app and go ahead and scan it. And then you would just be prompting that number each time you log in. Obviously, if it's already set up, that's what that example is kind of like. That is a code you would be given to log into the console. The other thing here is authorization. So 4 eyes authorization. So this is a new feature in 12.1 as well. If you want to minimize the risk of like a bad actor or a hacker that got a hold of your Veeam logins and it's getting in and they're trying to delete everything from your backups or your repositories, they're trying to delete other administrators under the users and roles or any type of setting changes, this is where this comes into play. So if you try to delete something and you have this checked, it's going to need approval from another Veeam admin before the change is sent through. So let's go through this quick scenario here. A backup admin tried to delete the data from a repository. In this case, the request is sent to another Veeam backup admin. They should receive an email that a request was sent, so then they can go in and approve or deny these requests. Now, if it's just sitting there stalemate for by default is 7 days and there's no response for an approval or a deny, it'll just automatically deny. So definitely one of those things is good to just make sure, like I said, a bad actor or something can't get in there and just delete everything. Let's talk about the malware detection. So this is starting new in version 12.1, where you can use native and external malware scanning methods to examine these backups. The backup data for potential threats, and identify any suspicious or infected items during the backup process. If you are I guess if it does find something that is marked as suspicious or infected, it will continue to be suspicious or infected until you go in, check that the backup, check out the backup, maybe run additional scans against it. Once it's good, you can mark the backup as clean. Otherwise, it's just going to keep reporting it over and over and over again. And I'll explain what those methods are here in a few. Let's go through just the scan backup. So on a previous slide, when I was talking about recovery aspects and stuff like that, on that same window, you can right click a server and just do a scan backup. So, we have a feature that allows you to use to scan using an AV or maybe like a Yara scan. You can see the different modes here. The find the latest clean backup. If you want to do a restore, maybe the latest clean backup was like 7 days ago. It would scan all those and see that. Maybe you want to find restore points in a range. You can definitely do that, or scan every restore point. At the bottom of the screen there, you can do the scan range and kind of just put that in based on your needs. If you're not familiar with the Yara scanning and stuff like that, definitely feel free to ask questions. We can get that documentation over to you as well. But it's definitely good to have those scans taking place. And then obviously we can automate those scans. I know we talked about SureBackup earlier, but the other aspect of SureBackup in 12.1 is you can just do a backup verification and content scan only. So, set this automatically on a schedule. Simply just add the job you would want to scan and choose the content analysis you would want to use for scanning, and it will go ahead and scan those backups. It's just, one of those things, making sure your backups are clean is at all times possible. So let's talk about the malware detection. So I mentioned there's 2 ways to do this. The first way here is the inline entropy analysis. So this is going to be reporting if your backup spiked in size or decreased. That's what we're kind of monitoring there. So if all of a sudden your backup goes from 5 terabytes down to 1 terabyte, there was some type of mass file deletion potentially, or maybe something else happened. But it's definitely suspicious activity. So we're going to tell you about it. Same thing as if it went from 5 terabytes to 10 terabytes. At the same time, the inline entropy analysis is also looking for onion links, ransomware notes, things like that. I'll definitely keep in mind it's best to monitor the CPU process during these times when the backups are going, because it may impact their performance in some cases. You can also adjust that sensitivity level to take a load off of the proxy. So if you have a pretty solid environment, maybe there's not a lot of change, you could change the sensitivity to maybe extreme, so data doesn't change much, but if it does, then you would get notified about it, instead of you know uh, just getting spammed in the proxies, taking a big hit. And then obviously if you have a really large environment that maybe uses like some heavy encryption, then you would most likely want to set that down to like low, so you're not getting alerted constantly. So that definitely can kind of work out in your favor there. The other thing here is the malware indexing. So I know we talked about guest processing earlier and the file indexing with the malware detection. So this is where this is going to come into play. So if you check the suspicious activity detection box at the bottom, whenever those files are getting cataloged and doing the system indexing, it's looking at file extensions. There is a list that we have. It is updated every night, or at least, if something new is there, it's going to be pushed every day. Otherwise, it's looking at that list every night to make sure it's there. In the Q&A, we can give you that path to that antivirus XML sheet. But there's a lot of files on there and just a lot of extensions, known malware extensions, no ransomware extensions, things like that. So by default, it's looking for all of those. It's also looking out for anything that just stands out, because if something's not on that list, but it seems odd, it's going to flag it as suspicious, and you will want to take a look at it. Make sure everything looks normal. And then obviously mark those backups as needed. If you wanted to, let's just say there was a file extension, let's just say .cat, okay? And that's not usually a known file extension, but it's used in your environment. You can click on that extensions to monitor hyperlink, and you can, say .cat is safe. Don't report on it in case it was reporting on it, and those are safe. So just as an example, don't update the antivirus list, the XML list, because that will just get overwritten every day with the changes that we have. So if you want to exclude something, you would do it through that hyperlink there. All right, we are getting very close to the end. Just go through some tips and tricks, things to consider that that can be helpful for you. The first one is going to be Quick Backup and Veeam Zip. Quick Backup, you can quickly perform backup of a VM without running an entire job. Not a lot of people, I feel like, know that. If you just want to back up one virtual machine because you're putting it, doing a maintenance on it or something the night, or something, instead of running the entire backup job that may have multiple VMs, you could just do a quick backup of that machine. And I'll show you where that's at. Also, Veeam Zip. So this one is very handy. It creates a full backup of a single VM or multiple VMs without running an entire backup job again. I see a lot of people will use Veeam Zip we're going to, let's just go through the scenario. We're going to shut a server off and decommission it tonight. Let's take one final backup. What you're going to want to do is do a Veeam Zip on it, because then you can set a retention. Instead of it breaking and possibly deleting from file backup maintenance, you can just run a Veeam Zip. You could say keep this Veeam Zip around for 1 year, 7 years, whatever it may be. you can set your own retention on those. So where that's found at is inventory, and then you will, navigate to your cluster host, find the VM you want or VMs you want, and right-click those, and you'll see those options there: Veeam Zip and Quick Backup. So that's going to be under the inventory view. So definitely some good resources there. The copy and move function. I know we talked about a little bit kind of about this earlier when we were explaining the per machine backup chains for the repositories. That is going to be where copy and move backups come into play. If you want to move all the backups of a backup job to another repository, or specify specific servers from one job to another while keeping the backup chain intact, you can do that all with the move feature. Next slide here. If you copy the backups, you can just choose, where you want to copy those backups to. You can check that box to set up an automatic deletion after some time if you don't need those backups to stick around and use storage space. But you can definitely copy those to another location as well. So like I said, we are almost done. Got a couple more things here for you real quick. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, but we do offer some hands-on lab experiences for you. So if you're not taking advantage of something that you may be useful for you, maybe like Veeam 1 or Enterprise Manager, maybe some new features in VBR, maybe a different product like M365. We have a whole lot of information here that you can go into Veeam. The link will be shared with you, or you can scan this QR code. This will take you to the lab environment. You can request a lab, test all the new features without actually bringing it into your environment, and kind of going through and making sure things, it's something that you want to add. There is some pretty cool ones in there, like the ransomware, like a kind of simulates a ransomware event. And what would you do? So, really good information there to just go in and play with as well, and request those labs and get a little bit more out of it. Next, we have, maybe you're aware, maybe you're not, but we do have a Veeam certified engineer. So in our session today, we covered, a lot of the most important and fundamental aspects of Veeam. There's still a lot to learn. We can talk about Veeam for days and days and days, and we won't be able to cover everything. There's just a lot that goes into it. If you want to expand your knowledge even further, there's a VMCE course. I believe it's 4 days long. It does include hands-on lab experiences and very good instructors that can lead those classes for you. So there's the link to if you're curious about it, to kind of go through, and you could take that certificate. Additional resources here. So we have some good resources. One of them, the revamped calculator, is that QR code. That's definitely a good one. It gives some good insight on if you want to know, based on, let's just say, like 50 terabytes worth of data, and I want to keep 30 days of backups. We're going to do an active full every week. It will give you the estimated number of how much storage space you're going to need. So definitely some good information there. There's also talks about proxy usage, on how many, how to allocate a proxy, how much resources it's going to use, and things like that. We do have the Help Center. If you're familiar with that, awesome. But there's a lot of information in those Help Centers for multiple different things. We have the Best Practice Guide, the Veeam Cookbook. That is almost one of my personal favorites. It's, if if you don't have a lot of time, but you need something set up and following best practices, the cookbook is there for you. It's straight to the point. Um, lets you know how to configure things and get through things, fairly quick without, reading article after article or going through something. Not to say that's not, a bad thing. Knowledge is power. Then we also have some hardware vendors that integrations, partner integration list there. Some KBs for security and how-tos, as well as the forums. Maybe you're familiar with the forums. We have a very active community there, and Veeam employees and product management, are there daily. So that's definitely a good spot to get some information as well. And then I was going to mention this. Hopefully, the deployment and use of, VBR will be smooth and successful. Hopefully, you already have it set up. If not, hopefully, this prepared you to, get it all set up really well and take advantage of all its capabilities. If you're interested in sharing your organization's success with Veeam, we love to hear from you. So please, keep this in mind. The email's on the screen. You can go ahead and reach out to us and, let us know if you're interested in answering, survey questions or, engaging with us and going through that. We also will have a survey after the call, though. That should start immediately after the webinar, I'm pretty sure. So I highly recommend people to fill that out. It definitely helps us, improve or consider different topics. I mean, just the feedback is extremely important to us. So please take a few minutes, fill that out. It will really help us. Based on your responses, we can make some changes, focus on specific topics, add topics, provide maybe a more depth in training on something. So please definitely fill that out. Yeah, I believe that is it for us. So hopefully this was informative. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast. You should be getting a recording of these as well, so you can go back and take a look at them. But thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and take care.